The day Esther Maddox rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, the sky was the color of a bruise healing from purple into gold, and every man on the main street stopped what he was doing to stare at a woman who had no business being there alone. She had a canvas satchel strapped behind the saddle of a roan mare that had seen better miles, a Winchester rifle in the scabbard along her leg, and a land deed folded into the breast pocket of her coat. A deed that had been questioned, challenged, legally contested, and finally upheld by a federal judge in Topeka, who had taken one look at Esther Maddox and decided she was more trouble to argue against than to simply approve. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, sun-browned from the long ride from Missouri, with brown eyes that carried the specific shade of patience that comes not from peace, but from having survived considerable disruption. She was not the kind of woman who made men comfortable, which was precisely the reason she had always been underestimated, and precisely the reason she had learned to use that underestimation like a second weapon. Caldwell sat at the edge of the Cherokee Strip, a rough-cut cattle town that operated on noise and livestock, and the particular lawlessness that settled into places where the rules were still being written. The cattle drives had been coming through for a decade, pushing longhorns north from Texas, and the town had grown up around that commerce: 2 saloons, a dry goods store, a livery, a land office, a church that doubled as a courtroom, and a jail that was almost never empty. It was the kind of town that judged a person on sight and rarely revised that judgment. Esther had been judged in worse places. She tied her horse at the post outside the land office and pushed through the door without removing her hat, which caused the clerk, a thin man named Delbert Oakes who wore his authority like an ill-fitted coat, to draw himself up with visible offense. "Help you, ma'am," he said in the tone of a man who hopes the answer will be no. "Esther Maddox," she said, placing the deed on the counter with a flat, practiced motion. "I have a land grant for 320 acres north of the Kaskaskia River. I need to register my improvements and file a notice of habitation." Delbert looked at the deed. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at the deed again, as though the paper might correct itself into something more reasonable. "This was filed under the Homestead Act," he said slowly. "Signed by Judge Ambrose Whitfield in Topeka on the 14th of February," she said. "It's legal, Mr. Oakes. I've had it verified twice, once by the judge's office and once by the Kansas State Land Commissioner. You'll find it in order." He cleared his throat. "It's just a woman alone, 320 acres up near the Strip. That's border country, Miss Maddox. That's country that'll chew a person up." "Then I'll endeavor not to be chewed," she said pleasantly. He processed her registration with the reluctant precision of a man who knows he has no legal grounds to refuse but very much wishes he did. She thanked him with exactly the degree of warmth that the transaction warranted, no more, and walked back out into the bruised gold afternoon. She had heard that phrase in various forms from various mouths her entire adult life. The country will chew you up. You'll fail before winter. A woman can't manage that alone. You don't understand what you're getting into. Her father had said it when she had taken over the management of his farm in Missouri after his hands gave out. Her brother-in-law had said it when she had sold that farm after her father died and announced she was going west. Her former fiancé, a banker from Independence named Harold Fitch, who had been quite specific about how a woman of her qualities ought to be directing those qualities, had said it with a gentleness that made it somehow worse than if he had simply been rude. She had filed the deed while Harold Fitch was still arguing about whether she was capable of filing the deed, and she had ridden out of Independence before he had fully understood that she was not asking his opinion. She had come to the territory to outlast every single one of them. She spent her first night in Caldwell at the boarding house run by a widow named Clara Sumner, who charged fair rates and did not ask unnecessary questions, which Esther appreciated enormously. In the morning she bought supplies: flour, salt, dried beans, cornmeal, lamp oil, a new axe handle to replace the cracked one she had carried from Missouri, and she arranged to board the roan mare at the livery for 2 more days while she took stock of the road north. It was at the livery that she first encountered Grant Calloway. He was shoeing a horse in the side yard, kneeling with the animal's hoof braced against his knee, and he did not look up when she walked in, because he was in the middle of something and did not see any reason to stop being in the middle of it just because a person had walked into proximity. This itself was unusual enough that Esther noticed it. Most men in Caldwell had already developed an opinion about her. She could feel those opinions landing on her like rain. This man was simply working, and she was simply someone walking near him, and neither fact seemed to require the other to adjust. He was somewhere around 30. She estimated lean in the way that men got who worked hard in open country, with dark blonde hair that had gone lighter at the ends from the sun, and the particular set of jaw and brow that spoke of a person who had thought through most of the arguments about things before they were raised. He wore his clothes like he had forgotten he was wearing them, which was to say comfortably and practically, without performance. "I'm boarding a roan mare," she said to the livery owner, who was an older man named Purvis. 2 days. $2, said Purvis. "Done," she said. "You riding out to the strip land?" Purvis asked, the way people in small towns ask things they already knew the answer to. "North of the Kaskaskia," she confirmed. The man shoeing the horse looked up at that, just briefly. He had gray-green eyes, the color of sage in late summer, and they moved across her face with a direct, unhurried quality that was not rude and was not flirtatious. It was simply the look of someone taking in information. Then he returned his attention to the horse. "Road north gets rough about 4 miles past the river crossing," he said, not looking up again. "Wash took out the bridge pilings last spring. You can ford it, but you want to go upstream about a 1/4 mile from the old crossing. Bottom is more stable there." He said it the way someone offered practical information without any inflection of doubt about whether she could use the information, without any undertone of concern about whether she should be going at all. Just the fact, offered plainly. She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, already focused on the nail he was setting. She thought about that the whole ride back to Clara Sumner's boarding house. She thought about how he had not paused before telling her. He had not inserted any clause about whether she ought to be riding out there alone. He had simply told her about the ford, the way one person told another person about a ford. She did not know his name yet, but she remembered the gray-green eyes and the way he had not made her feel like a problem to be solved. The road north was everything Purvis, and the man at the livery had implied rutted, unpredictable, crossed twice by shallow creeks that required care, and lined with the kind of emptiness that either broke people or settled into them like a foundation stone. Esther felt it settle. She had always been a person who found open space clarifying rather than frightening, which her mother had once told her was evidence of a character defect. Her mother had meant it critically. Esther had accepted it as a reasonable description. Her land was 320 acres of grass and sky and occasional stone, bounded on the south by the Kaskaskia, and on the north by a rise of limestone that broke through the soil like the backbone of something old and patient. There was a spring that Esther had been told about by the surveyor's notes. She found it on her second day, tucked behind a stand of cottonwoods, clear and cold, and perfectly positioned relative to where she planned to build. There was no structure yet which she had known. The Homestead Act required improvement, and she had 5 years to prove up. She was not intimidated by the absence of walls. She had slept in worse places than open grass. She made camp in the shelter of the cottonwoods and spent her first 3 days walking the land, learning its character. She found where the soil was deepest and darkest, where the drainage ran, where the winter winds would hit hardest. She was systematic, which was something her father had taught her before his hands had given out. He had been a careful, methodical man who respected the land, and that respect had transferred to her even if the land itself had not been legally transferable to a daughter under the customs of the time. On the 4th day, She rode back into Caldwell for the lumber she had ordered before leaving, and she found a problem. The lumber was there. The man hired to haul it out to her land was not. He had taken another job, the lumber yard owner explained, with the apologetic imprecision of someone who had let a commitment dissolve for reasons that were convenient rather than compelling. There were other haulers, he said, but most of them were occupied with the cattle season. He spread his hands. He was sorry. Esther was not interested in sorry. She asked around the lumber yard, the dry goods store, the livery. The livery was where she found Grant Calloway again. He was not shoeing a horse this time. He was repairing a wagon wheel with the focused patience that seemed to be the central characteristic of the man, and he looked up when she came in with the same unhurried directness as before. "I remember you," he said. "Chicaskia land." "Esther Maddox," she said. "I need someone to haul lumber north, about 4 wagon loads. My original hauler took another job." He considered this without any particular urgency. "I have a wagon and 2 good horses," he said. "I'm not otherwise engaged this week." "What's the timber for?" "A house," she said. 12 by 16 to start with a linta for storage. I'll be doing most of the framing myself once it's on site." There was a pause. Not a pause of doubt, she noticed, not the pause that preceded the gentle clarification that a woman might not be aware of how complicated framing was. It was simply the pause of someone doing arithmetic. 4 loads, Chicaskia and back, call it a day and a half each run, he said. "I can start tomorrow morning if you have the lumber sorted." "I have it sorted," she said. "What do you charge?" They agreed on a price that was fair without being charitable. He did not discount it in the way that would have implied she needed a discount, and she did not argue it up the way she might have argued with a man she suspected of condescension. It was simply a transaction between 2 people, and that simplicity felt to Esther in that moment like something close to luxury. His name, she learned, was Grant Calloway. He had been in Caldwell for 2 years, operating independently, hauling, some carpentry work, occasional ranch labor when the seasons required it. He had come from Colorado, he said, when she asked on the first hauling run, not because it was any secret but because the conversation had arrived at that point naturally. He had spent time in the mining country around Leadville, had decided that underground work was not suited to his particular relationship with the sky, and had drifted south and east until Caldwell had seemed like a reasonable place to stop for a while. "Do you plan to stay?" she asked, which was perhaps more direct than she had intended. He thought about it. "I haven't found a reason not to," he said, which was not quite an answer but was honest. They made 4 trips north over the course of a week and a half, which was longer than the original estimate, because the second trip was delayed by rain that turned the creek crossings into genuine negotiations. Grant Calloway handled his horses with a quiet competence that Esther found easy to work alongside. He was not the kind of man who filled silence with noise, but he was also not the kind who created silence as a statement. He was simply present in the work, and presence in work was something Esther respected above most other qualities. On the 3rd hauling run, they stopped to rest the horses at the cottonwood spring on her land, and he looked out across the 320 acres with an expression she could not quite classify. "You're going to put the house here," he said. "Northeast corner of the cottonwood stand," she said. "Spring to the west, so water is close. Limestone ridge to the north to break the wind, southern exposure for light and warmth." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That's a good site. Not for a woman or for someone on their own, just that's a good site," delivered with the conviction of someone who had spent enough time reading landscape to know one when he saw it. She looked at him sideways. "You sound surprised," she said. "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm just saying it's a good site. People ride through land and don't see it properly. You've seen it." She looked away, out at the grass moving in the late morning wind, and felt something shift slightly in her chest. Not dramatically, not the way things shifted in the kinds of stories she had read when she was young, and believed that love arrived like weather, sudden and categorical. This was smaller than that, and more precise. It was the feeling of being seen by someone who had not decided in advance what they were seeing. She had spent her entire adult life surrounded by people who had decided in advance what they were seeing when they looked at her. She did not say any of this, because they were not yet at the point of saying such things. She said, "The horses look rested," and stood up, and they loaded back onto the wagon and drove the last mile to the building site. The framing took her 3 weeks. Grant had finished the hauling by then, but he came back on the 4th day of framing because he had been passing through the North Road on another errand and had stopped to see how the timber was holding up in the joints. He stayed for 2 hours and helped her square the north wall, which had been giving her trouble because the limestone ground made it difficult to set the corner post without it wanting to angle. He found a way to brace it that worked, and he explained it as he did it so that she understood why it worked, not just that it did. That was, she thought, the difference between helping someone and teaching them something, and he had chosen, without apparent deliberation, to do both. After that, he came out to the building site 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. He said each time that he had been in the area. This was plausible once. Esther did not examine it too closely, because she found that she did not mind his presence, which was a more significant admission than it might have seemed. He was not crowding her. That was the thing. He was not coming to supervise or to take over or to demonstrate that things were being done incorrectly. He came. He helped with whatever needed an extra pair of hands. He asked questions about her design choices with genuine interest, and then he left. He occupied exactly the space that was offered, and not 1 inch of the space that was not. The house was framed and roofed before the first August heat set in. Esther stood in the center of her 12 by 16 main room with a packed dirt floor and bare timber walls, and felt something so enormous and so particular that she could not immediately identify it. Then she realized it was pride, the specific, unqualified variety that has no asterisk attached to it, no considering the circumstances, or for someone in your position. Just plain pride hers earned. She cried briefly in the way that she allowed herself to cry quickly and without audience, facing the north wall and the limestone ridge beyond it, and then she was done and she went outside and started on the lean-to. Grant Calloway rode out 3 days later with a load of rope and a coil of new wire she had mentioned she needed for the fence line, which he had picked up in Caldwell without being asked. "I'll take it off the price of the fence work," he said, "if you want me to help with that." She looked at him for a moment. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked directly. He did not seem thrown by the directness. He considered it seriously the way she had noticed he considered most things. "I suppose," he said, "because you don't seem to expect it." She was quiet for a moment. "Most people aren't kind to me without an agenda," she said. "They're kind because they want to tell me I'm doing something wrong, or because they want something from me, or because they want me to be grateful in a way that keeps me obligated." "I know," he said. "That's not what I'm doing." "How do I know that?" He met her eyes steadily. "You don't yet," he said, "but I figure you're a woman who can tell the difference given time." She hired him to help with the fence line. Over the following 10 days, they worked side by side from morning until the light gave out, setting posts in the hard soil, stringing wire, working around the limestone outcroppings with a combination of adaptation and stubbornness that suited them both. The conversation that developed in those 10 days was not the sudden, self-conscious kind of conversation that happens when 2 people realize they are supposed to be getting to know each other. It was the quieter, more durable kind that happens when 2 people simply exist alongside each other long enough to become familiar. She learned that he had grown up in Ohio, had gone west at 20 with the idea of finding something, had found several things that were not it, and had arrived at a kind of peace with not knowing exactly what he was looking for. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly, that he read whatever he could get his hands on. He had carried 3 books in his saddlebag through Colorado and had replaced them one by one as he found others, and that he had a strong and specific opinion about the treatment of horses that she found both admirable and, in a way she had not anticipated, deeply appealing. He learned that she had managed her father's farm single-handedly for 4 years, that she knew how to read a balance sheet, set a fence post, preserve meat, dress a wound, and identify whether coming from the northwest by a particular quality of pressure in the air. He learned that she had been engaged once and had ended it, and that she did not regret either the engagement or the ending, but that the whole experience had left her with a very clear sense of what she did and did not need from another person. He learned that she was funny when she chose to be, in the way that very intelligent people were sometimes funny, quietly and precisely, without announcement. He told her, one evening when they were sitting at the edge of the spring cooling their hands in the water after the day's work, that he had never met anyone who seemed so entirely themselves. She looked at the water for a moment. "What does that mean?" she asked. "Most people," he said slowly, "are always negotiating something, who they are in the presence of this person versus that person, what they can afford to be. You're just what you are, all the time." She was quiet for a moment. "I used to negotiate," she said. "I was very good at it. I knew how to be smaller so that people around me were more comfortable. I knew how to make my knowing less obvious, my certainty less visible." She paused. "I stopped doing that somewhere around the Missouri border." "Good," he said simply. She looked at him. The spring water was very cold and the evening air was settling toward something sweet, and she was aware, with a specificity that surprised her, of the exact distance between where his hand rested at the edge of the water and where hers rested. "Grant," she said. "Esther," he said. It was not quite a question or an answer from either of them. It was something more primary than that, two names, offered like evidence. She looked away first, back at the water, and the moment passed into the category of things held for later, but she felt it continue in her chest like a coal held in from the wind. The summer moved forward with the particular intensity that summer carried in the territory heat that hit like a solid thing in the afternoons, thunderstorms that arrived with enough drama to feel personal, and the underlying rhythm of work that she had built her days around. She planted a kitchen garden on the east side of the house, put in a root cellar using the natural depression in the limestone, established a routine for hauling water from the spring that was efficient enough not to eat her mornings. She acquired 2 chickens from a homestead family passing through on their way south, which she considered a significant improvement in her morning situation. She also dealt with Harlan Bryce. Harlan Bryce was her nearest neighbor, the word neighbor being used expansively, since he was approximately 2 miles east along the river, and he had been ranching in the area for 6 years, which in his view conferred a territorial authority that the land records did not technically support. He came to her land for the first time in mid-July, riding a good black horse with 2 of his ranch hands behind him, and he wore the expression of a man who had decided on the outcome of the conversation before he arrived. "Miss Maddox," he said, not dismounting, which was itself a statement. "I'm Harlan Bryce. I run cattle north to the Strip, been doing it since '76. That spring of yours puts water on the east pasture I've been using for seasonal grazing." "My spring is on my land, Mr. Bryce," she said. She was holding an axe handle and did not set it down. "The survey is on file at the land office." "Those survey lines have a way of being interpreted," he said. "I'd like to work out a grazing arrangement, a fair one." She studied him. He was a man in his mid-40s who had been used to being the largest presence in any negotiation he entered, and she could see the slight adjustment in his expression as he registered that she was not going to be moved by the theater of him being on horseback while she stood below. "I'll consider a fair grazing arrangement," she said, "if you come to that conversation in writing with specific terms, dates, and compensation. Come back when you have that, and we'll talk." He had not expected that. He had expected capitulation or conflict, and she had given him neither. She had given him procedure, which was the one thing men like Harlan Bryce were consistently unprepared for. He rode away more carefully than he had arrived. She told Grant about it the following afternoon when he came out to help her finish the fence line on the east side. He listened without interrupting. "He'll be back," Grant said when she finished. "I know," she said. I'm not worried about back, I'm ready for back. He looked at her for a moment with that steady, measuring quality. I know you are, he said. I just mean if he comes with more than words, I'd like to know. I can handle Harlan Bryce, she said, with a slight sharpness that was reflex more than feeling. I know that too, he said evenly. I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying I'd like to know. As a person who, he stopped for a moment, as a person who's concerned. The slight hesitation told her something. She studied the fence post she was holding for a beat longer than necessary, then drove it with 2 efficient strikes of the mallet. I'll tell you, she said, if it becomes something that needs telling. What she did not say, what she was only beginning to allow herself to fully acknowledge, was that she was already telling him most things. Had been for weeks, with the naturalness of a person who has found someone whose reception is worth transmitting to. She had not had that in a very long time. She had not, if she was being precise about it, been sure she would allow it again. Bryce came back in August, as predicted, with a written proposal that was less a fair arrangement than an attempt to codify his existing use of her water with a token payment that she calculated was about 1/8 of fair market value. She wrote him a counter-proposal that was detailed, legally grounded, and reflected a familiarity with water rights law in Kansas that visibly unsettled him. She had been preparing that counter-proposal for 2 weeks because she had anticipated the move. He took the counter-proposal back to his ranch to think about it, and by September, after one more round of correspondence, they had an agreement that was genuinely fair. He paid her for seasonal water access. She reserved the right to terminate if her cattle operation required it, and both parties signed in front of the Caldwell land clerk. She was building a cattle operation. This was not a surprise to her. It had been part of the plan since Topeka. She had arrived in the territory with enough capital to run the first year on provisions and materials, had now spent most of that on the house and fencing, and the next phase was stock. She started with 2 cows and a bull, purchased from a ranch south of Caldwell in September, and she cared for them with the same systematic attention she gave everything: feeding schedules, condition monitoring, reading the livestock guides she had brought from Missouri, until she knew them well enough to argue with them. Grant helped her build the small barn in October, which was a significant undertaking, and which took 3 weeks because the weather had turned and they lost days to cold rain. The barn was solid when they finished, better than solid, genuinely good work, the product of 2 people who both understood what it meant to do something correctly the first time. She noted that he took pride in it, not in a showy way but in the way you could see when someone stood back from finished work and felt it was right. The day they finished the barn, she made a proper meal, the first real meal she had been able to make since getting the stove properly installed and leveled, which had been its own 2-day enterprise. She roasted a chicken from the 2 she had acquired in the summer, which she had expanded to a flock of 6, and made biscuits and preserved bean stew, and they sat at the small table she had made from the leftover lumber and ate without any particular ceremony and with a great deal of comfort. "This is the first time I've eaten at a table in this house," she said. "How have you been eating?" he asked. "Sitting on the floor," she said, "or outside?" He smiled, not a large smile, but the real kind, the kind that involved the lines around his eyes. "You could have told me, I'd have made you a table sooner." "I didn't want a table sooner," she said. "I wanted to earn the table." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I understand that." She believed that he did. They had been working alongside each other for 5 months when something changed, or rather when what had always been there between them ceased to be sufficiently described by the word, alongside, and required something more accurate. It was a November evening, cold enough that they had lit the stove in the house, and the windows had fogged with the warmth, and she had been reading by the lamp, while Grant sat across the table working on a piece of leather harness he was mending. He had stayed later than he usually did because the sky to the north had gone gray-green with the threat of a fast-moving storm, and neither of them had said anything about why he was still there, because naming it would have made it a thing that required resolution. She looked up from her book. It was a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which she had been working through since Topeka, and found him watching her, not with the quality of someone who has been caught staring, but with the quality of someone who simply is what they are. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You have an expression when you're reading, like you're in an argument with the book." "I often am," she said. He smiled that real smile again. "What are you arguing with tonight?" "The idea," she said, "that a woman of exceptional intelligence and capability has to be punished for it, in fiction and in practice." "Is she punished?" "In the book," said Esther, "yes. She ends up in a smaller life than she was capable of. The author calls it a tragedy of circumstances." She paused. "I think it's a tragedy of other people's limitations." Grant set down the harness. He looked at her with a directness that she had grown to recognize as the particular way he moved into something serious. "Is that what you're afraid of?" he said. "Someone else's limitations making your life smaller?" She met his eyes. "I was," she said. "Not as much as I used to be." He was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the first skitter of sleet was audible against the window. "Esther," he said, and his voice had that quality it had had at the spring in August, a naming that was something more than identification. "Grant," she said. The storm arrived outside with a rattling insistence, and neither of them moved for a long moment, and then she closed the book and set it on the table, and he reached across the narrow table and covered her hand with his, very simply, very squarely, with no part of the gesture that was uncertain. She looked down at his hand on hers. Then she looked up at him. "I should tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I am not a simple woman," she said. "I know that. I've been told that most of my life in ways that were intended as criticisms. I'm not going to become simpler because you care about me. That's not how it works for me." "I know," he said. "I need you to mean that," she said. "Not just say it. I've watched you build a house and a barn and a fence line and an argument and a legal agreement and a kitchen garden and a life," he said. "I'm not surprised by you, Esther. I'm not frightened of you. I'm not waiting for you to become easier to understand. You're exactly what I see, and what I see is—" He stopped, started again. "You are the most remarkable person I have been in the company of in my entire life." The sleet hit the window harder. The lamp flame bent sideways and then straightened. She turned her hand under his so that their fingers threaded together, and that was the beginning of it, or rather the acknowledgement of the beginning, since the beginning had been, if she was honest, somewhere around a ford upstream of the old bridge crossing, and a pair of gray-green eyes that had simply given her information without any reservation about whether she could use it. November in the territory was not the time for any gradual or leisurely development of romance, because November in the territory required you to be occupied with surviving November, which demanded constant attention. But something between them had shifted into the open, and it remained open even as they were both busy with the practical requirements of the season. She with her stock and her stores, he with the work that took him back to Caldwell for stretches of days. But he came back to her land each time with a consistency that she stopped being surprised by and started being grateful for. He kissed her for the first time in December, on a bright cold afternoon when the sky was the sharp blue that only arrived after a heavy frost and the ground glittered, and she had been hauling water from the spring, and had stopped to watch a hawk crossing the limestone ridge, and he had stopped his horse at the edge of the cottonwood stand and watched her watching the hawk. And when she turned and saw him there, looking at her with that steady, particular quality, she walked toward him without quite deciding to. And he stepped down from the horse without quite deciding to, and it was the least decided thing that had ever happened to her, which was to say it felt more inevitable than chosen. He cupped her face in both cold work-roughened hands, and she held the water bucket at her side and tipped her face up and let the kiss happen the way weather happened, completely and without apology. She was warm in the cold. She was, for the first time in a very long time, simply and entirely in one place at one time, which was here, which was this. When they broke apart, neither of them spoke for a moment. The hawk had gone over the ridge. The frost glittered. "Well," she said finally, which was not the most elegant thing she had ever said. "Well," he agreed, which was equally inelegant and perfectly fine. She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, the kind that came from a place that had not been accessed for long enough that it felt almost unfamiliar, like a room that had been closed and is suddenly aired. He looked at her laughing, and his expression was the most open thing she had seen on any face in years. Winter progressed. He spent increasing amounts of time at her homestead, not inappropriately by the standards of the time, but at the edge of what could still technically be called neighborly, which they both knew and which they navigated with a mutual respect for the practical realities of the place and period they lived in. There were enough people within Harlan Bryce's circle of awareness that reputation was not a thing that could be entirely ignored, and Esther was too smart to give Bryce or anyone else a lever against her standing. But there were long evenings at the table, and conversations that ranged from practical to philosophical without seeming to travel any distance at all, and a quality of ease between them that Esther recognized, with a combination of wonder and gratitude, as happiness. Not the performance of it. Not the negotiated asterisk variety. Just happiness, moving through her like warmth through a properly insulated wall, even, thorough, and persistent. In January, he told her that he wanted to marry her. He did not ask it as a question first, which was the conventional form, but rather made it as a statement of his own position, which she appreciated enormously, because it meant she was not being petitioned but informed of a desire, and could respond with her own desire rather than a judgment of his. "You want to marry me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I understand if that's complicated for you. I know what you gave up to be here, and I know what being here means to you, and I would never ask you to make this smaller for me." "What would it look like," she said, "in practical terms?" He had thought about it. She could tell he had the organized quality of someone who thinks about things before presenting them. "I'd move out here," he said. "Your land, your homestead. I have some savings, not a lot, but enough to add to the operation. I'm a good carpenter and I'm decent with cattle. I know you don't need me to manage anything, but I could be useful, and I could be here." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, January was being brutally thorough about itself. "I want to tell you something," she said, "something that matters." "Tell me," he said. "I came here to prove something," she said. "Not to anyone in particular anymore. I passed that point somewhere in the framing. I came here to prove it to myself, that I could build this, that I could make this work, that I am who I believe myself to be." She paused. "If I marry you, I need that to remain true. I need this to still be what I built. I need to be Esther Maddox, who built something and happens to love Grant Calloway, not Grant Calloway's wife who was helped." "That's who you are," he said immediately, without any deliberation. "That's who you'll be. I've never thought of it any other way." She believed him. That was the remarkable thing. After 26 years of having to evaluate whether people meant what they said about what she was and what she could do, she looked at Grant Calloway and she simply believed him, because he had never given her a single reason not to, and because the pattern of his behavior over the past 7 months was its own kind of proof, more reliable than any declaration. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." He reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his, and they sat like that in the January firelight, and it was the most quietly joyful moment of her life. They were married in March, at the Caldwell church, which doubled as the courtroom, in a ceremony presided over by the Reverend Thomas Haas, who had a calm and practical approach to matrimony that Esther appreciated. Clara Sumner from the boarding house came, and Purvis from the livery, and 3 homestead families from the North Road, who had introduced themselves to Esther over the winter, and who had come to the particular kind of community bond that develops between people who face similar conditions. There was no one from Esther's family. Her father was dead. Her sister had written 2 letters arguing against the whole enterprise of the territory that Esther had not answered, and Harold Fitch was presumably still in Independence, being carefully conventional. Grant had a younger brother named Daniel who had sent a letter from Ohio that arrived 2 weeks after the ceremony, which was par for the course with correspondence across that distance, and which contained a warmth and humor that told her something pleasing about the family. Harlan Bryce attended, which surprised her, until she reflected that Bryce was a man who understood strategic positioning. Having a dispute resolved and converted into a standing agreement was the kind of outcome he preferred to have witnessed and social. He sat in the third pew with his hat in his hands and gave her a nod when she passed that contained, she thought, a grudging respect. She accepted it in the spirit it was offered. The spring that followed their marriage was the first season she did not carry everything alone, and the physical difference was significant. Having another capable person meant projects that had been theoretical became actual. They expanded the cattle herd by purchasing 4 more cows from a drive passing through, negotiated on price in a conversation where Grant had the sense to let her do most of the talking because she was better at it, which he knew, and was not made small by knowing. They built a proper well house over the spring access, built a second room onto the house, and began breaking ground on a second pasture. They argued, because they were both strong-willed people who had opinions and the forthrightness to express them, and they learned how to argue, which was not the same as not arguing. They argued about the pitch of the second-room roof in April, which Esther won on structural grounds. They argued about whether to sell 2 of the young cattle in the Caldwell market or hold them through summer for better weight, which Grant won on timing, and which Esther acknowledged was correct when the September prices bore him out. They argued once, seriously and with real heat, about a decision she had made regarding the water agreement without consulting him, and that argument ended not with either of them winning, but with both of them acknowledging something more important, that they were a partnership, and partnerships required the inconvenience of consulting each other, even when the independent decision would have been faster. She apologized for the exclusion. He accepted it without using it as leverage, which was itself an act of love. The territory was changing around them. By 1883, the cattle drives were still ongoing, but the railroad had reached further, and the nature of the business was shifting. Less the romantic, impractical long drive, and more the systematic commerce of organized ranching. Caldwell was adapting. Some of the wildness that had characterized its first decade was being replaced by the particular civilization that follows when enough people have decided to stay. Schools were being discussed, a proper courthouse, a second church. Esther was part of that conversation, whether she had intended to be or not. She had become, almost by accident and certainly through the consistent example of her own conduct, a kind of model in the community, the woman who had come alone with a land deed and a Winchester and had built something lasting. Other women homesteading in the area sought her out, sometimes just to talk to someone who understood what they were facing without having to explain it from the beginning. She was neither a saint nor a social reformer, but she was honest and practical and genuinely interested in people who were doing hard things, and that combination proved useful. She thought sometimes about the injustice of it, about how many women like her had come before, had attempted before, and had been turned away or broken or discouraged to death, not by any single dramatic cruelty, but by the accumulated weight of small denials and assumptions. How many Esthers had there been who had lacked the particular combination of stubbornness and legal knowledge and sheer bloody-mindedness that had gotten her through the Topeka land office and onto a horse headed north? She did not carry this thought as bitterness, but as something more useful, a kind of awareness, a habit of looking at the women around her and asking what they needed and whether she could provide any part of it. Grant understood this about her without needing to be told, because Grant had always been a person who saw systems as well as individuals, who understood that the particular difficulty Esther faced was not unique to her, but was the manifestation of something larger. He was not the kind of man who believed himself exempt from the responsibility of noticing. In the summer of 1883, Esther became pregnant. She was not surprised. She had been expecting it, in the pragmatic way that a woman who has been married a year and is not taking any particular precaution expects such things. But she sat with it for 2 days before she told Grant, because she wanted to understand her own feelings about it before she had to navigate anyone else's feelings about it. What she found, when she examined it honestly, was that she was glad. Not just willing, not just accepting of the inevitable, genuinely glad, in a way that connected to something she had not known she wanted until she was capable of wanting it without condition. She had not been ready to want children in the context of her previous life, because having children in that context would have meant abandoning the self that was doing the wanting. Here, on 320 acres north of the Chicaskia, in a house she had framed with her own hands, married to a man who had never asked her to be anything other than what she was here, she found that she could want it. She told Grant over dinner. He set his fork down and looked at her with an expression that moved through several registers too quickly for her to catalog all of them: surprise, then something deep and warm, then a look that she recognized as the same one he had worn that first November evening when she had been reading by the lamp, the look of a man who is seeing something precious and is being careful with the fact that he is seeing it. Esther, he said, and it still had that quality, the naming that was more than identification. March, I think, she said, give or take a few weeks. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Are you all right? He asked. I'm very well, she said. Are you? I have never in my life, he said, with a careful precision that told her he was choosing the words and meant them to be exact, been happier than I am at this table right now with you. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned her hand and threaded their fingers together, the same motion she had made the first time in the November storm. Good, she said. That's the right answer. The pregnancy was not easy. No pregnancy in the territory in 1883 was easy, in the sense that the practical circumstances were demanding regardless of the internal experience. And she was a woman who was used to doing things and did not easily adjust to the periods when doing things was not advisable. Grant managed the balance between helping and crowding with a consistency she found remarkable. He took on work she did not ask him to take on, without comment, without requiring her to acknowledge it, and he was there when she needed him and not in her way when she did not. This was a finer distinction than it might sound, and harder to execute. She kept working through most of the pregnancy, with adaptations, and she kept thinking, kept planning, kept running the operation with the same analytical attention she had always given it. She ordered 2 additional books on cattle management from a supplier in Kansas City. She corresponded with the county about road improvements that would benefit the homesteaders north of the Chicaskia. She wrote a long letter to her sister in Missouri, not in response to the earlier letters that had argued against her choices, but a genuinely open account of her life as it actually was. And she received, 3 months later, a reply that was cautious but warm, and which she took as a beginning. The baby was born in late February of 1884, delivered with the assistance of a woman named Mrs. Hollins, who served the homesteading community as the closest thing they had to a midwife, and who was a practical, calm, experienced person that Esther trusted as much as she trusted anyone. Grant was outside the room through the whole of it, which was the custom, and which he respected because she told him it was what she preferred, and he did not argue because what she preferred in this situation was determinately her own business. The baby was a boy. He was small and loud and immediately himself in the way that newborns were, insistent about his own existence in a way that Esther found both exhausting and completely wonderful. She held him in the lamplight and felt the ordinary miracle of it move through her like the spring water, clear and cold and essential. Grant came in when Mrs. Hollins led him and stood at the edge of the room for a moment as though he was not sure he deserved to be as close as he wanted to be, and she said, "Come here, Grant. in the voice she used when she meant something simply and entirely, and he crossed the room and sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at the small, loud person between them with an expression that she had no word for except love. "James," she said. "For my father." He looked at her. "James Calloway," he said. "James Calloway," she agreed. "Though he'll learn his own name in the end, he'll decide what it means." Grant looked at the baby for a long moment. "He'll be all right," he said quietly. "He's yours." "He'll be more than all right. He's ours," she said. Grant put his arm around her carefully, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and James Calloway, who was approximately 4 hours old and had strong opinions about the temperature of the room, continued to be loud and insistent and entirely himself. The years settled in the way good years do, with the texture of lived life rather than the smooth certainty of stories. The cattle operation grew. By 1886, they were running a herd of 30 head and had built a reputation for well-managed, quality stock that earned them a consistent market in Caldwell and beyond. They hired 2 hands for the heavy cattle work. A young man named Pete Rodriguez, who had grown up ranching in Texas, and who was one of the most naturally skilled stockmen Esther had ever seen, and an older man named Ezra Wells, who had been homesteading himself before a drought had taken his own claim, and who had a quiet steadiness that both Esther and Grant valued. Grant had built a real workshop by then, attached to the barn, where he did the carpentry and smithing work that continued to bring in supplemental income, and he had acquired a genuine reputation for that work, the kind of reputation that brought people 40 miles for a commission. He was not diminished by the fact that the land was Esther's and the primary enterprise was hers, and the decisions were primarily hers. He was, if anything, proud of it in the specific way of someone who has chosen well and knows it. Esther was part of the group that pushed for the establishment of a school in the North District in 1885, which took 2 years of petitioning the county, and 1 meeting with the state education commissioner that she handled with the same combination of preparation and precision she brought to all formal negotiations. The school opened in a converted homestead building in 1887, with a teacher named Miss Abigail Park, who was 23 years old and from Cincinnati, and who faced her first year in the territory with a combination of terror and determination that Esther recognized with deep familiarity, and responded to with the particular warmth she reserved for people doing brave things. She and Grant brought Miss Park to dinner several times that first year, and supplied the school with what they could spare from the homestead firewood, food for the winter sessions, the George Eliot novel, and several others from Esther's collection that had expanded considerably by then. By the end of the year, Miss Park had found her footing and was teaching 15 children from 7 homestead families, and Esther felt the satisfaction of something extended, of a thing she had built that reached beyond her own land. Harlan Bryce, for his part, had largely made his peace with the situation. The water agreement remained in place and was renewed each year on terms that were consistently fair, and he had come to the practical acknowledgement that Esther Maddox Calloway was a more useful neighbor than an adversary. He was not a friend, and she did not require him to be, but they had reached the productive neutral that was the best available outcome given what he was and what she was. James grew from a loud, insistent infant into a loud, insistent child who was curious about everything and frightened of nothing, and who had, from the very beginning, an obvious and indiscriminate love for the land he was growing up on. He walked the limestone ridge with Grant at 4 years old, was on a horse at 5, and by 7 had opinions about cattle management that were, disconcertingly, sometimes correct. He had Grant's gray-green eyes and Esther's way of going very quiet when he was thinking something through, and the combination in a child was equal parts delightful and unnerving. In 1887, James was 3, and Esther was 31, and Grant was 35. She became pregnant again. She experienced this with slightly more equanimity than the first time, because she knew more about what it involved, and with a joy that was no less for being familiar. The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1888, and she was an entirely different creature from James, quiet where he was loud, still where he was perpetually in motion, watching everything with large dark eyes that had Esther's coloring, and Esther suspected Esther's quality of internal processing. They named her Clara, for Clara Sumner, who had been the first person in Caldwell to treat Esther simply as a person without any qualifying clauses, and who had died the previous winter at an advanced age that she had never specified precisely, and which Esther did not attempt to calculate. It was a naming that felt right, a continuation, a thread carried forward. Life on the homestead by 1889 was rich in the ways that were not always visible from a distance but were deeply felt from within. The house had grown, 2 added rooms, a proper front porch, a covered well, a garden that produced enough to both eat well and preserve for trading. The cattle herd was stable and profitable. Grant's workshop was a genuine enterprise. Pete Rodriguez had stayed on. He had become, over the years, more like family than employee, eating meals with them when the work brought him in close, helping with James and Clara with the easy affection of someone who had found the place where he fit. Ezra Wells had married a widow from the South Road in 1886 and had eventually moved to a farm of his own, which Esther and Grant had helped him establish. A circle of the kind of help that had been given to them returned. One September evening, when James was 5 and Clara was 1, and the cattle were settled for the night and the workshop was dark and the house was lit from inside and the limestone ridge was black against a sky full of stars, Esther sat on the front porch with Grant and listened to the territory being itself around them, the wind in the grass, the sound of the cattle, the distant yip of coyotes on the ridge. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "I think about that clerk in Topeka," she said. "When I filed the deed, he looked at me the way people look at something they've decided in advance is wrong, and I signed that paper and I walked out of that office and I thought I was going to have to fight everyone the whole way." "You fought a fair number of them," Grant said. "I did," she agreed. "But not you." She looked at him in the starlight. "I never had to fight you." He was quiet for a moment. "You never should have had to fight anyone," he said. "No," she said. "But the world is what it is. And in the world as it was, as it still is, most places, you were the exception." She paused. "You've always been the exception." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the night was enormous and private around them, and the grass moved in the wind, and the stars did what stars had always done in this sky. Before the territory was called the territory, before the cattle drives, before the deeds and the land offices and the homesteaders, before any of the particular history that had brought these 2 specific people to this particular porch. The stars moved in their old, reliable way, indifferent to human drama but somehow in the fact of their constancy deeply comforting. "Grant," she said. "Yes," he said. She smiled, not a polite smile, but the real one, the deep one, the one that she reserved for being genuinely happy in the way that did not require any performance. "Nothing," she said. "I just wanted to say your name." "Esther," he said, because it was fair. Inside, Clara stirred in the small sounds of a 1-year-old finding a comfortable position in sleep, and James's boots were visible just inside the window, where he had fallen asleep in his chair with a book about horses. The stove ticked as it cooled. The wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like water. This was what she had come for. Not any single element of it, not the land, not the cattle, not the legal victory, not even Grant Calloway, who had been an entirely unforeseen gift. She had come for the capacity to build it, and the chance to discover what building it would produce, and what it had produced was this: a life that was entirely, authentically hers. By 1890, the territory was being spoken of in the papers as likely to come into formal statehood. Not Kansas, which was already a state, but the land to the south, the Oklahoma Territory that had been opened in 1889 in the Great Land Run, which Esther had watched from a distance with a complicated mixture of recognition and unease. Recognition, because she understood the force that drove people to stake claims in impossible circumstances. Unease, because the land being staked had been promised to others first, and the history of such promises in this country was not a comfortable thing to hold. She said as much to Grant, who sat with the statement in the way he sat with difficult truths, without flinching away and without false resolution. He had spent time in Colorado, where the question of whose land was whose had been answered in ways that left a long, quiet damage. He did not minimize the weight of what Esther was saying, and she did not expect him to. "We built here," she said, "on land that was legally ours. And I know what the legal structure was built on top of in a longer view." "Yes," he said. "I don't know what to do with that exactly," she said, "except to know it and to not look away from it." "That's not nothing," he said. "It's not enough either," she said. "No," he said, "it's not, but it's where you start." This was one of the things about Grant Calloway that she had come to love with a specificity that went beyond the general warmth she had for him. His willingness to sit with things that were not resolvable, to not pretend that everything had a clean answer, to stay in the difficulty alongside her rather than trying to solve her out of it. It was the same quality that had made him simply tell her about the Ford, that first day, the assumption that she could handle the actual information. The spring of 1891 came in with the green urgency of a territory spring, and James was 7 and wearing his father's old hat, which fell over his ears in a way that he did not acknowledge as problematic, and Clara was 3 and had become a dedicated companion of the 2 dogs that had joined the household the previous year, a cattle dog named Flint and a smaller, scruffier animal of uncertain origin that Clara had named Button, and that Grant had objected to on principle, before becoming entirely devoted to. Esther found, in that spring of 1891, that she had everything she had come for, and several things she had not known to come for, and that the combination was more than she could have designed from the beginning. She was 35 years old, and in full possession of her health and her faculties and her land and her cattle, and her partnership with Grant and her children, and her place in this community that she had helped to build. And she understood that this was not a neutral fact, that she was precisely the evidence against every argument that had ever been made against women like her, and that the most effective form of that evidence was simply to continue being it. She had outlasted all of them, not with bitterness, not with triumph that required anyone's humiliation, but with the most durable proof available, which was the proof of time and continued existence. Harold Fitch was, she had been informed in a letter from Missouri that had arrived the previous year, a bank manager in Independence with a perfectly conventional marriage and 3 children, and a settled life that was in no way objectionable. She wished him well, and meant it, the way she meant it when she thought about the clerk in Topeka and the brother-in-law in Missouri, and everyone else who had told her she could not with residual anger, which would have required her to still be diminished by them, but with the simple recognition that they had been wrong, and that being wrong about Esther Maddox had not, in the end, hurt them as much as it had failed to hurt her. On a warm evening in May of that year, when the grass was at its fullest green and the cattle were well, and the children were asleep, and the homestead was the particular quiet that comes after a long, productive day, Esther and Grant sat on the porch again and looked out at the limestone ridge. "You know what I've never asked you," she said. "I can't imagine what you haven't asked me," he said, with the dry quality that she had fallen in love with somewhere around the 3rd fence post. "I've never asked if you were happy," she said, "because I thought I could see it, but I want to hear it." He turned to look at her. In 9 years his face had acquired the marks of the territory, the deeper lines from squinting against the sun, the particular weathering that came from years of outdoor work, the slight silver at his temples that had arrived 2 winters ago. He was, she thought, the best-looking thing she had ever seen in her life, which was not objective and she did not need it to be. "I am," he said, "the most comprehensively happy I have any right to be." He paused. "I think about sometimes the roads that brought me here, all the choices that could have gone differently. Colorado, if I'd stayed in Colorado, I'd have missed this completely." "I think about that too," she said. "Topeka. The judge could have decided differently." "He couldn't really," Grant said. "Not once he saw you," she laughed. "That's very flattering." "It's accurate," he said without vanity. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We have more cattle than I projected in the original plan," she said, "by about 30%. "Is that relevant right now?" he asked. "I'm just noting it," she said, "for satisfaction." He pressed his lips to her hair. "Note it," he said. "And the school enrollment is up to 23 students," she said. "Also relevant." "Everything is relevant," she said. "That's what I like about life." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that she had spent years accumulating like a record of good things. She felt it against her temple where her head rested on his shoulder, and she felt the warmth of the May evening and the sound of the grass, and the knowledge of her children sleeping inside and her land stretching out to the limestone ridge and her spring running cold in the cottonwood stand and her cattle settled in her pasture. And she felt simply, completely, permanently herself. The woman who had come to the territory had come to outlast everyone who said she could not. She had. Grant Calloway had been the first person who had never said she could not, and she had loved him for 9 years and intended to love him for the rest of her life. And that love was not the asterisk kind, not the conditional kind, not the kind that required her to be smaller. It was the full kind, the kind that made room for exactly who she was, and she had found it on the north side of the Chicaskia River, in a place she had built with her own hands in a life she had claimed as her own. James came out to the porch in the morning barefoot and still half asleep, wearing the oversized hat at an angle that suggested it had spent the night on his head, and he climbed into the space between them on the porch bench with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who has never doubted that this was his place to occupy. "Flint got in the garden again," he reported. "We'll fix it," Grant said. "Clara's awake," James added. "She'll tell us," Esther said, because Clara at 3 was extremely effective at communicating her awareness and her needs. As if to prove the point, Clara's voice arrived from inside the house, imperious, immediate, and entirely convinced of its own significance. Esther and Grant looked at each other over the top of James's hat. "She gets that from you," Grant said. "She absolutely does," Esther agreed with no apology at all, and she stood and went inside to her daughter into her house on her land in her life, the life she had crossed the territory to find and had found completely. Outside, the limestone ridge caught the morning light. The cottonwoods moved at the edge of the spring. The grass was green all the way to the horizon. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.